On Steve's barbecue triangle, a technique can either be fast, easy, or perfect, but life is full of trade-offs, so you can only pick two. This pellet grill rib recipe produces perfect results, and it's easy even if you're a beginner. The trade-off is it's not fast at all. But I promise you, it's worth the time because this technique has won me several top 10 calls in barbecue competitions. They produce the best ribs I've ever made, and you don't need to probe, bend, or test them for doneness with the risk of either undercooking them or overcooking them. They'll just come out predictably perfect every single time, so let's get smoking. I'm starting by slicing open the cryovac bag holding these 2 racks of spare ribs. I like to cut on the bone side so I don't mess up the presentation side. What I look for in the store is a thick and really marbled rib without too many huge deposits of solid fat. I also try to avoid shiners, that's where the bone shows through on the top of the rib, but sometimes you just get what you get. By the way, this technique will work on really lean ribs that aren't well marbled at all. In fact, it's particularly well suited for them. Now, as for the silver skin on the back of the ribs, there's different opinions on whether you should remove it or not. To remove it, I just slide my knife under it to separate it from the bone, get a grip on it with some paper towel, and then I tear it off. Flipping the ribs over, I'm slicing off the thinner end without any bones, and I'm cutting the rib tips off so I have more of a St. Louis style cut to work with. And then of course I have to regale my cameraman with tall tales of outlandish barbecue theories.
Did you know, Brock, that there's actually a theory that left-sided ribs are actually more tender than right-sided ribs? Because no, this is an actual thing. It's an actual thing. Because pigs supposedly are right-handed, they will push up from the ground when they sleep with their right legs, and that sort of strengthens their right side, so you get tougher right side ribs, and the left side is supposedly more tender. It's the same with briskets. I don't know if that's true or not. Some people think it's true, but it's an interesting theory.
Moving on to seasoning the ribs, I'm using Smoke Trail's barbecue brisket rub on these ribs. I designed it specifically for brisket, but I found it actually goes on really well with any kind of barbecue, including ribs. It's very peppery with different sized granules of salt and pepper for maximum texture, and it also has dried sumac berries in it, which I really love. They provide some citrusy tartness, and they have natural sugars in them that darken up the bark quite well. This rub is available on Amazon, and I'll link it in the description section below if you want to try it out. After I apply a heavy coat, I'm gonna let this rack soak up that rub for at least 30 minutes. Now it's time to smoke the ribs. Both racks are going on my Pits and Spits Maverick 1250 pellet grill on the top rack at 200 degrees Fahrenheit. The one on the right looks burnt because I tested searing it as a first step rather than the last step for this video, but I found searing it as a final step tasted much better and crispier. You're gonna see a lot of different racks of ribs in this video because I tested a bunch of different racks of ribs to develop this technique. Now I'm just gonna let those ribs smoke away at 200 degrees for the next few hours on my Pits and Spits Maverick 1250, which is particularly well suited to this method of cooking ribs. The sponsor for this video, Pits and Spits, sent me this Maverick 1250 pellet grill, and since they sent it to me, it's been my go-to grill for making ribs and brisket every single day. It has an optional smoke cage attachment, which helps me get perfect Texas-style briskets. I have a video on how to do that, by the way, and with the optional removable sear plate and smoke cage, I can get insanely good sears on my fast-cooking meats, which normally I'd have to use a charcoal grill for, so this is a really versatile pellet grill. And unlike many other pellet grills, the Maverick is super beefy, it's fully welded, and it has a thick steel design that really helps retain a lot of heat when things get up to temperature, which results in more even cooking. It also has a fully slide-out bottom and top rack, which makes cooking on it super convenient. I'll put a link to the Maverick as well as the smoke cage in the description section below for you guys to check it out if you're in the market for an excellent pellet grill. After 2 to 3 hours, the ribs will hit 145 degrees internal, and you'll notice they've multiplied into 4 racks on the smoker. That's because I tested removing them at 145 degrees, 165 degrees, and 200 degrees, and I found that removing them at 145 degrees just results in the best juiciness and texture, and I've tested this so many other times in previous videos before. This test just confirmed it. I'm now laying down 2 sheets of heavy-duty foil and plopping down some ghee, which is basically clarified butter. I like it better than butter because there's no water or milk solids in it, and I'm also lactose intolerant, so that's important for me. So it's basically just like butter flavored oil. That being said, you can just use butter if that's all you have. The ribs are now going on the foil meat side down so they can confit in the fat. That's a fancy French term for cooking meat low and slow submerged in fat. It seems to produce better results for me than adding H2O based liquids like water, apple cider vinegar, or juice. I think that's because the fat coats the meat and it helps retain the moisture, whereas water-based liquid kind of leaches the bark and dissolves the bark. It washes out all the water-soluble flavors of the smoke. So I find that wrapping with fat seems to produce better results. That's my theory and my experience anyway, but I should note that there is a book out there called Modernist Cuisine, which I highly respect and I refer to it all the time. And they are of the opinion that it doesn't matter what cooking method you use, as long as you coat the meat in some sort of fat as a last step, it'll be pretty much indistinguishable from using confit as a cooking method. I kind of disagree because I think there's water soluble versus fat soluble considerations. I think that the oil potentially holds more moisture into the meat because it coats the outside of the meat and prevents moisture from escaping. And I also think that sous videing or braising something in water can lead to that more washed out flavor and potentially pot roasty flavor if you overcook it. Whereas using a confit method, cooking low and slow in fat, just retains the bark better, it retains the texture, retains the smoke flavor, and it just has an overall better mouthfeel and texture than sous vide. Anyway, that's a long-winded explanation for why I'm using a fat-based liquid for wrapping my ribs instead of a water-based one like a lot of other people do. Now that the ribs are wrapped, they're going in my holding oven to hold at 150 degrees Fahrenheit for 18 hours. And yes, this is what I was talking about when I said that this method is not fast. It's like the barbecue triangle that I introduced at the beginning of this video. I stole this from the software design world. Basically what I'm trying to show here is that you can have perfect results that are fast, but it's not gonna be easy. You're gonna have to be an expert and you're gonna have to have years of experience to be able to do that. Or you can have fast results that are also easy, but it's not gonna be perfect. In fact, it might not even be that good because nothing is easy, fast, and perfect. And in this recipe, you can have easy results, i.e. this can be the first time that you ever do this and you don't need to learn those skills to test for doneness of when the ribs are perfectly done. And you can have perfect results, but it's not gonna be fast because we're using this super low and slow holding technique. Now, for this video, I tested smoking the ribs to 145 degrees, 165 degrees, 200 degrees, and then holding each rack for 18 hours. And I also tested a traditional cook where I took the ribs up to 200 degrees probe tenderness and then rested them for an hour like most people in the world cook their ribs. What I found is that the 145 degree ribs that were removed and then held for 18 hours had the best juiciness, the best texture. And whenever I've cooked these ribs using this technique in the past, my friends and family say it's the best ribs they've ever had. They like them better than all of the other ribs that I've made using other techniques. I finally started getting top 10 calls in barbecue competitions after switching to this technique, whereas I always scored low using the traditional method. And I can get these results because I use that long 18-hour hold period at a low temperature of 150 degrees to slowly cook the ribs and render the collagen and cook the meat while still retaining a lot of juiciness. And that slowly brings the ribs to the perfect texture. And it gives me a much longer window of when those ribs are at the perfect doneness. So where a professional barbecue team would have years of experience and they know exactly when to pull those ribs off at that higher temperature, they're cooking it up to 190, 200, 203. They're feeling the ribs, they're probing them, they're bending them, they're checking them every 10 minutes. They know exactly when they're at that perfect tenderness. Beginners aren't gonna know that, but this method allows any person, even if it's the first time that you've ever cooked ribs, to get that perfect competition quality texture, and it's easy to do, you just have to follow the steps. The hardest part is you need a reliable holding device that holds your ribs at 150 degrees Fahrenheit, and it's not like 130 degrees Fahrenheit, it's not 170 degrees Fahrenheit, it's 150 degrees Fahrenheit, and it needs to be pretty steady at that temperature. 99% of the time, if this technique doesn't work for people, it's because their holding device is not holding at an accurate temperature. Now, the cheapest and most reliable way to hold ribs is to bag and sous vide them. A sous vide machine is like $100 on Amazon, and you'll use it for all sorts of other things. You can also adjust your oven temperature down to 150 degrees and hold them in there. You can use a slow cooker or turkey roaster as long as you confirm it actually holds the meat at 150 degrees. You can also use an electric smoker, or you could just use your pellet smoker if it goes down to 150 degrees. And if it doesn't, some pellet grills only go down to 165 or 170 or even 180. You can just move the temperature probe, the temperature sensor, under the grate, the deflector plate, and then it'll read at a higher temperature and tell the computer that it's reading at a high temperature, but that translates to a much lower temperature above the deflector plate. I've done this in multiple barbecue competitions, and that's how I hold my meat in barbecue competitions where you're only allowed to use charcoal or wood-fired smokers. If you're interested in that modification, I'll post a video where I talk about it more. Now, if you cook a lot of barbecue like I do, then you might want to think about getting a used commercial hold holding oven, or you can get a new holding oven for a pretty inexpensive price from a company called VIDE. I have a couple of viewers that have got these holding ovens before and they said they work really well. Now, 18 hours later the next day, I'm taking the ribs out of the foil packets a few hours before dinner and giving them a sear on my Maverick 1250. The Maverick has a removable sear plate and also the smoke cage, which I filled with charcoal to give the ribs some extra heat. You can also just use a grill for this step if your pellet grill doesn't have a searing feature. I'm searing the top of the ribs until they sizzle and smell kind of like bacon. This will give us a nice grilled meat flavor. It'll crisp up the top of the bark and it'll render the fat on top of the ribs into that ooey gooey texture that makes all the boys and girls go wild. Is the searing step really necessary? I personally think it is. I tested both methods, unseared and seared, in this video, and I found that searing it produced way better results, and my friends and family agreed wholeheartedly. Should you sear before or after? I recommend searing after. I tested multiple racks in this video, searing before and after at different temperatures and holding times and using the traditional method, and I found that searing after produced crispier results, more fat cap rendering, and just better texture and flavor than searing first. If you sear it first and then hold it, the sear flavor and the grilled meat flavor, it kind of gets washed out during that holding period. So doing it last is definitely what I would recommend. Now, moving on to saucing. You could just serve up your ribs right after searing them, but I like to sauce them and allow the sauce to set up and get tacky for around 30 minutes to an hour. That's something like 250 to 275 degrees. This also helps get some additional smoke flavor on them because we didn't get much pulling them at 145 degrees during the initial smoke phase. I'm using Blues Hog's original sauce and I'm letting that tack up for roughly 30 minutes. 30 minutes later, these are looking absolutely perfect. The texture is juicy, they are bite through, the bark is crispy, they smell like bacon, and they just have this nice sweet exterior from the sauce. The perfect rib.